what we want to go through, and we've got an introduction into who Dan is, but let's hear it from you, Dan. So jumping right into it, how did you get into your role at CSIS? I mean, you were there for 30 years, so a long time. What brought you to CSIS, and can you tell us a little bit about when you first started learning about India's interference? Now, I'll preface, we've already had this conversation between me and Dan. There's some things that Dan can't talk about because obviously being a security officer, he's have a pledge to secrecy under the Security Act. But whatever you can tell us, let us know. So how you got involved and how you first started learning about India's foreign interference.
Certainly. Oh, does this work? Yeah. Certainly, Balpreet. This works? Yeah. And Sat Shri Akal. That's the extent of my Punjabi from living in Surrey, BC for 4 years. I'll say how I got started. I had a funny career path into working for CSIS. I finished my history degree, university, and that landed me full-time job in Fat Albert's, which was a submarine and pizza parlor in Ottawa. And I read this book called Men in the Shadows, which was on the RCMP Security Service, which had been disbanded because of all sorts of, let's just say, improper activities. And I put an application into the RCMP Security Service, and I forgot about it. I came to Toronto, and I ended up working, selling shoes at Yonge and St. Clair. And I guess the newly created CSIS had my CV from the Security Service. They called me. I got through the selection process. Next thing I knew, 7 months later, I was up at Camp Borden with 32 other strangers from across the country. Anyway, finished training. My first assignment was in Toronto in what we called the Soviet Intelligence Services. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is I've had a history of dealing with transnational repression, but we didn't call it that. So my first 5 years as a probationary field officer, we were working to detect Soviet or KGB presence and activities in various communities, Ukrainian community, Estonian, Lithuanian, and Latvian community, and then we were countering that through all sorts of operations and double agent operations and things like that. What we called it, though, was activities of hostile intelligence services. Nobody said, we're dealing with transnational repression. We didn't know what we're talking about. There also wasn't any foreign interference. But that was my introduction into it, because what the Soviet intelligence services were doing is they were targeting the anti-regime elements, what today we would call dissenters, right? The people that actually had fled communism, building a new life in Canada, but were still, you know, in some ways critical of that regime. Anyway, as was said, I did work a lot in counterintelligence. I worked a lot of counterterrorism. Oh, okay, there we go. And I worked a lot in counterproliferation. And I was, in a certain sense, aware of not the activities of the Indian services, but I was aware of the fact that they were almost a perennial problem or challenge for national security in Canada. I know that in the late 80s, there were some demarches, and there was at least one who was PNG'd, kicked out. There was activity at a high level even before CSIS was created that the RCMP Security Service was dealing with. But it was off as kind of almost ancillary to a lot of the main investigations and operations that were on, for the simple reason that they weren't what we called a hard target. They weren't like the Russian services, they weren't like the Chinese services, they weren't like some other ones. They were just kind of out there, and they were kind of like a pseudo-ally and partner, if in a certain sense, in a very limited sense. Fast forward, I seem to always have some aspect of my career touching on South Asia. For a while, I headed one of the analytical units. We were dealing with South Asia. And then by the mid-90s, we were more seized with the emerging Mujahideen threat, which became Al-Qaeda, and a few other areas, and some threats coming from Pakistan. So I retired after about 31 years. Figured that's enough. I did some contract work at Communications Security Establishment. That's our signals agency. And then I was asked to teach a course at the University of Ottawa Professional Development. I liked it, they liked me, and I eventually was asked to be director of the program, and I've kind of expanded that. Where we get into my advocacy as far as Indian activities and particularly the Sikh community is in March 2023. I was called to testify at one of the House committees. This is when everything was going crazy about China, foreign interference, the Liberal Party. And at one point an MP, I think he was Liberal, said to me, well, there must be other countries doing foreign interference in Canada. And I said, yeah, of course. I said, India. I said, India's been doing this for years. And then a couple months later, I was at another committee. But key point, in early May, the former National Security Intelligence Advisor, when she testified, she said quite categorically, India is a major player in terms of foreign interference in Canada. I remember it well. It was front page newspaper, right on there. And that told me that the activities I was aware of in my time in the service had obviously gone up in terms of gravity and seriousness, and I would say maybe to a certain degree sophistication. So there was a lot of that. So I continued doing various outreach efforts. I spoke to the Senate Committee on Bill C-70, which is a criminalization of transnational repression and foreign interference. And I managed to weasel myself a position in the Commission of Inquiry. There's a lawyer called me in Toronto. He said, why don't you get into the inquiry? Because I represent the Pillar, retired CSIS. And I managed to convince the Pillar Society, which is retired CSIS, to let me represent them. Took a while. They agreed to it. And then I applied and I got accepted as participant in the inquiry. So I was able to see what was going on. And I can tell you, the inquiry staff, the lawyers, everyone there, they saw a lot of stuff. They saw a lot of material. They had a lot of in-camera testimony, some stuff that hasn't been publicly revealed. But I remember it was January 2024, and it was just starting the second stage, and the commissioner of the inquiry said, India is up there. Because until then, it was China. And she said, we got India up there. And then there was all sorts of consternation over there. So that's really been my, I guess you could say, exposure to this during and after my career. And I've done a lot of media interviews as well. I find what the Indian government did, what they call political assassinations, murder, the extortions, all the stuff you heard about. It was a year ago, the RCMP commissioner, it was at Easter, actually. I remember it well. He made the announcement of all the activities so they would stop, and then they kicked out six diplomats. So I'm still gobsmacked by the extent of these activities in Canada against Canadians. And
so there's a lot there to get into. So there's a few things I wanted to sort of explore with you. One, you said India has been a perennial presence, so for a very long time. Two questions. What, from your perspective, are the motivations behind their interference here? And second, what do they do? Like, from your perspective, what sort of activities are they engaging in? And then I have a follow-up on that, which is you mentioned that the commission said India was named. The fact that it wasn't named in the commission was really concerning to our community. So even though you've said it's a perennial presence, why have they been allowed to conduct this activity for so many years, even though there's books written about it? Why has it been allowed to sort of go unnoticed by the mainstream for so long? So three questions: motivations, activities, and why has it gone unnoticed?
Yeah, I would say in the early days, and I wasn't privy to what went on, I wasn't working it, I wasn't even in the service when a lot of it started. I think it was more just seen as, certain countries' intelligence and security services are kind of tiered. Okay, there's some that you have concerns about, and there's others you don't. And I think the blunt answer is, if we go back 20 years ago, the government wasn't that concerned about the Indian intelligence services, whether we're talking about RAW, whether we're talking about the Intelligence Bureau or what became the NIA. I just don't think it was up there in any way. It wasn't just, they weren't agencies that were committing what we call state espionage and all the really spy stuff. It was just stuff in communities in that area. How it got to the point it did, I think it's clear when you don't check foreign interference, when you allow it to kind of almost mutate in a way, you get to a point where they have a level of confidence and arrogance that they can get away with it. And that's what I think has happened. Like I don't know since I retired, but looking at those activities that took place in the last 2 or 3 years in Canada, they must have felt some freedom of operation.
Okay, so we, for the past 40 years, have seen things like media manipulation, manipulation of visas, having actual Punjab police officers, army officials posted into diplomatic missions, consulates, and the High Commission. Is this common, having intelligence officers from foreign countries, or police officers, or army officers who are doing things like issuing visas? Is this something that's unique to India, or do you see it in other places as well?
No, usually they don't. Usually they've got, we would say, bigger fish to fry than issuing out visas and following people. Sometimes it's a good position for intelligence because you can then get access to people and travel and things like that. But from what I've been reading in the press, it seems to have been, part and parcel of their day job, is they're coming here exclusively for that.
So you were at the commission, and we were also, of course, collectively the Sikh Coalition, the BC Gurdwara Council, Ontario Gurdwara Council, and the World Sikh Organisation of Canada. So being there, what was your perspective? How does India rank amongst all the countries that are currently engaging in foreign interference in Canada? What does it look like on a global scale? Where does India sort of rank on that list?
Okay, well, let's define foreign interference, because there's a lot of Canadians that think foreign interference is everything that a foreign state does. And so we have to go to the CSIS Act, Section 2B, which is where it's a foreign state has conducted certain activities that have to be clandestine, which means sneaky, and to get a certain policy objective. So they are either getting, let's say, a politician, someone in government, could be municipal, provincial, federal, to do their bidding, witting or unwittingly. So that's the start for what is considered foreign interference. And historically, China has dominated that. They have perfected it. It's been comprehensive, and that's mostly what the government's been concerned with. At least I know. I used to run the China program. So that was right there. It was in your face, and it was clandestine, and you would deal with it. Somehow, at some point, I don't know when, India got involved more into that political target, if you want to call it that, of meeting the CSIS threshold, which is clandestine activities, to cert that in. So we're still talking about the electoral interference. And that's what the commissioner put up there with China on that interference. But now a lot of people look at foreign interference as it's also transnational repression. So again, China was the dominant one on that, and trying to get people back to China and all that stuff. Russians not at all, hardly at all. Iranians maybe a little bit. But that's where India at some point, whether it was a policy shift in their government, their intelligence services, got involved with what we see happening with the tragedy when Canadians were actually killed. So we'll still call it foreign interference, transnational repression, definitely the latter, but it just seems to have emerged not that long ago. And we can speculate as to, with the government in India, we can speculate as to why that's happening.
So is India unique in the way that it's conducting foreign interference here in Canada? Is there anything particularly different than the other countries that it's doing?
Well, certainly with the transnational repression, they're unique, because we haven't seen that. China doesn't do that. They don't, as of my knowledge, they don't kill people. India is pretty well unique on that. But they're using, in my mind, the same template or the same process they would use in areas in their region, in Pakistan, things like that, and they've sort of transferred that. And I'd say they're not unique in the sense that they're going after a specific politician or looking for a certain outcome in the election, because we're seeing that with China. And we saw that with the with the Russians in the U.S. So they're kind of, I guess, trying to get into that league.
So we've also seen India try very hard to label Khalistan activism as terrorism, by default extremism. Every single bilateral meeting between Canada and India for years has always had this come up as an issue. And I think Stephen Harper, even though his tone has changed significantly since he left office, probably got it right in 2012 when he said that what India defines as extremism is actually just political advocacy it disagrees with. How successful has India been in framing Sikh advocacy and specifically Khalistan advocacy as extremism, and how has that influenced the way Canada has dealt with Indian interference?
I think they've been fairly successful in the sense that you have to look at who this is all directed at. And I think it's directed at the public in India. Okay, that's who the Indian government is talking to. So if you create this impression that overseas, and in a country like Canada, let's say the Sikh community is all criminals and terrorists and a threat to the national security of India, then to be seen capable and strong enough to go overseas and in their mind neutralize that threat, that pays big dividends at home. Whether there's an election, shows the government is strong, we will put up for this. Because you see this when you see some of the killings and then some of the attempted killings and all the news in Canada and the way it plays out on the media in India. They've got, Khalistani terrorists killed and the flashing lights and everything else like that. And so people that are voting, or people that are, they want to think their government is strong in protecting them, are doing that. And I think that's why a lot of those criminal activities were done the last few years. The extortions, the blackmailing, the arsons. It's to create that illusion that Canada is lawless, the government's weak, Prime Minister has cocaine in his airplane, all that other nonsense. And then we meaning the Indian government, we will go abroad and we will deal with these terrorists. We're not putting up with it anymore because the West is weak and all that stuff. So I think it's the create that illusion a bit and tie it into the national security of the country of India.
So in 2018, when Prime Minister Trudeau went to India, we saw that narrative reach a crescendo around Khalistan in Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau is weak on extremism. There are cabinet ministers who are extremists. And we saw that narrative actually catch hold in even domestic media here. Do you think that narrative has traction amongst the establishment? It's hard to generalize, of course, but amongst government and amongst CSIS. Is it possible, is that one of the reasons why India has been allowed to grow their activities in such a way?
Well, it's working now. Okay. I think that, part of it is, I think, the Sikh community in Canada is extremely successful. Every sector you can imagine, cabinet ministers, you name it. And I think that grates a bit on various Indian governments, particularly the nationalist government. And so I think they play into that. They see the Trudeau Liberal government as, instead of being supportive of the Sikh community, they see it as being sympathetic to terrorists and extremists. And so they play that in that. Then, if you look at what disinformation does, disinformation in many ways plays on those cleavages and things we already have in Canada. So if you have some Canadians who already think, yeah, these people could be terrorists, then that type of propagandizing from the state of India can exacerbate that, and they can play into that. And that's probably what we've been seeing. I mean, there's been all sorts of efforts to show the government weak, the Liberal government coddling terrorists. We had stories about hand grenades thrown at embassies that there's no grain of truth to it at all. But it's to create the illusion that this is what's going on in Canada.
So how dangerous is that? in terms of India's disinformation. I mean, we've seen leaders like Jagmeet Singh called basically a terrorist, saying, I mean, just recently it was said that falsely he couldn't enter the US. I mean, that's completely false. He has entered the US, that he's been denied a visa to India. I mean, we know why he's denied a visa to India. There's lots of people in that boat. But even benign, and you could say, politicians who haven't really said anything about Khalistan or Sikh advocacy, like Harjit Singh Sajjan or Navdeep Bance, how dangerous is it? How do you think that's had an impact?
Well, it's dangerous in a way because it plays into a lot of these right-wing echo chambers too. You've got a lot of, let's be frank, you've got a lot of racism, and if you can easily exploit that, or you could exacerbate that by putting out that type of propaganda, like the leader of an opposition party is a terrorist, and then again, you know, people don't always check. They just read something or they hear something. Oh, he wasn't allowed to go to the United States. Oh, that's good. That's because he's a terrorist. And then that plays into the nonsense narrative that Canada's got all these terrorists going south of the border and everything else. So it is, I think, potentially dangerous if you look at people seemingly finding these right-wing narratives or extremist narratives very attractive, and then it's not lost on foreign states to try to exploit that.
So I mean, that could very well be a part of playing into anti-Sikh hate that we're seeing rising in Canada. Yeah. What can Canada do to counter disinformation? So just to give you some examples, we saw what are apparently legitimate Indian news sources, India Today, News 18, Times of India, all report that the accused assassins in the Hardeep Singh Nijjar case had been released due to lack of evidence. We saw disinformation around the fact that the Hague Commission had exonerated India from any involvement in the Hardeep Singh Nijjar assassination. They actually said that, so it was interesting, they took a passage which says that a disinformation campaign was targeted at Prime Minister Trudeau, but no link to a foreign state could be found specifically to that disinformation campaign. They used that passage to then claim that there was absolutely nothing to be found by the Commission linking India to this assassination. So how can Canada push back on this? Are there any mechanisms? And secondly, how can the Sikh Canadian community push back on that?
Yeah, I don't know if it helps to say I'm not really an expert on disinformation, but I don't know. I think it's just a matter of trying to get as much information out there and as much education as you can. I mean, there's a lot of garbage going on the internet. You know, I'm sure communities are rife with all sorts of stuff on social media that you can probably follow the breadcrumbs back and see what country it's coming from. But short of policing the internet, and like I say, I'm not an authority on any of this, I don't know what you can really do.
I mean, in our election guide, which is available online, one of the things that we've suggested is that Canada should have a more robust system to push back on disinformation. The EU has actually a website where it's kind of like a Snopes, where they debunk disinformation. We have suggested that Canada may want to look into something like that. But going back to the 2018 trip, that was clearly a setup. If you look at the NSICOP report, it clearly says that these news stories were planted to set this trip up for failure, and the actual event in which a so-called extremist from Canada was allowed to attend and was then photographed with some politicians. I mean, the question is, of course, you know, how did he get a visa to go to India in the first place? How successful do you think India was with that 2018 trip? And then, of course, one of the outcomes of that 2018 trip was a Canada-India framework to counter extremism and terrorism, which was basically an intelligence sharing agreement between Canada and India, which we understand may not have been signed had things not gone so sideways. So what are your thoughts on that entire thing?
Well, I don't want to sound like, you know, the grumpy old spook, but those signing counterterrorism agreements things don't really mean an awful lot. I mean, it doesn't impact on the day-to-day operations, let's say, of CSIS or CSE. I think a lot of it is at maybe a foreign ministry standpoint, where they sign off on this, but it certainly doesn't mean there's going to be an exchange. I do know from my time in the service, when it comes to things like exchanging information with foreign states about somebody else or a Canadian national, there's a extremely rigorous process, which also includes not sharing because of the human rights issues. And so in that particular case, or I should say in dealing with India in general, the government's well aware of the fact that there's serious reliability issues on anything coming from India, and then there's a lot of caution in terms of what's going to be provided to India.
So what are the standards when looking at intelligence provided by India? Are there any benchmarks that people have to meet when they're looking at this information? What is that?
Yeah, well, we learned this a bit last year with the revelations of what was going on in Canada. A lot of their methodologies are coercion. Okay, now I spent my entire career in what we call human sources, talked to people, cultivated people, and coercion does not work. Let's leave the human rights suspect for a side. As a practical point, it just does not work. Not mention there's a human rights issue to it, but that's their MO in getting it. Either incentivized with money, or a witness said this, and you have no idea what's behind it. And that's why they've generally been seen as extremely unreliable when they give information. So a typical situation would be, Mr. Bloggins is a terrorist. Okay, well, what information do you have? And then there would be just some sketchy thing, or some witness said he robbed a bank or something. And so their agencies, their government has just been viewed, generally speaking, as not credible.
Okay. So shifting now to the diplomats. So you mentioned earlier that in 1987 a number of Indian diplomats were expelled, and now after the October announcement there were a couple of diplomats who were expelled, and then at Thanksgiving there were the High Commissioner, the Consul General of Toronto. Was this a symbolic thing, or do you think they were actually involved in something for something like this to happen?
I don't know about the one in 87. I'm not going to speculate on it, but I would say, first of all, to kick out a diplomat, a PNG, it's usually way beyond the lines of acceptability. So for example, when you find out someone's a spy, they're not a diplomat. I know in the case of CSIS, we don't say, please kick them out. We want them to stay. But what happened, I think, with the situation with the Indian diplomats is the intelligence and probably some law enforcement evidence that was collected was showing that their activities were so bad, right? I mean, they were coercing people, they were organizing all sorts of criminal activities in Canada, that there's absolutely no way they could stay in the country, because unless I'm mistaken, even the Consul General or the ambassador was linked to this. I mean, he's not an intelligence officer. He was using his diplomatic position to do these criminal activities. So my guess is Foreign Affairs could not possibly countenance that and keep them in the country. So that's a real off-the-grid reaction by the Canadian government.
So of course we can't say for sure, but it would seem that they were actually involved in nefarious activities, the criminal activities that were being referred to by the RCMP.
Yeah, it appeared to it. What came out was that they were getting information, using coercion, passing it back to this gang in India. The gang in India was then tasking the criminals, or maybe not even criminals, maybe getting people to become criminals in Canada to commit these deeds. So they were probably doing a lousy job of it, and they were probably observed, monitored for quite some time. And then my understanding as the RCMP commissioner, when he made the announcement on Easter Monday last year, it was to get the Indians to stop. That's why they made that unprecedented disclosure, was for them to stop it, and then they kicked them out.
So if they were engaged in criminal activity, now we of course know about diplomatic immunity, but what were the tools available to hold them responsible? Is there anything that could have been done, or moving forward could be done?
I don't think anyone's ever going to violate that, diplomatic protection. So you arrest one diplomat and prosecute him, and then all of a sudden all Canada's diplomats are being rounded up, and they didn't do anything. you know, there have been cases short of, I think, murder where diplomats have just quietly left.
So in terms of what's happened over the past few years, what should have happened in terms of protections? So I can share with you, this is something that I was shared with Dan earlier. In 2022, we had shared with CSIS that we felt that under the guise of gang wars and criminal activity, Khalistan activists would be targeted. And after that, we saw that Brampton Singh Malik was shot. After he was shot, we saw a list of Sikh activists published by Indian newspapers, which at the top of the list was Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who it was said that they were responsible for Mr. Malik's death, and they may be next in terms of gang warfare and being targeted. So we passed that on as well. And then one of the individuals on this list contacted us and asked for us to let CSIS know that he was aware of a gang hit on him. We then saw that CSIS provided them all duties to warn, and some of them asked not to stay home anymore. But basically then for the next year, we're not aware of anything that happened. And reminders were sent. Hardeep Singh Nijjar talked about this openly. Even the day he died, he talked about it openly, that he was on a hit list, and he didn't think that there was anything that anyone could do about it. When I've spoken with individuals who received these duties to warn, they're telling me that they get this piece of paper, they read it, the police or whoever's there take it back from them so they can't keep it. And then they're asked, who do you think is responsible? Who do you think is targeting you? And they feel almost belittled. You know, why are you asking me? You tell me who's trying to target me. And they're complaining that there's no real resources provided to them to protect themselves. So what can the Canadian government do in these sort of situations where we know that individuals are being targeted by a foreign government? Are there any mechanisms to support them or protect them? Or if they're not, should there be?
Well, there should be. I mean, I don't know what transpired in 2022. I do know, having worked in the organization for 31 years, you're not going to get any information that someone specifically is going to be killed, and you're not going to do anything about it. I know that for a fact. Obviously there was some sort of breakdown or something if the government, whether it's CSIS or the RCMP, had information that these individuals were going to be attacked or killed, and there was a vague duty to warn. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you could speculate that they didn't have a name. I don't know. I don't know the source. It wouldn't be to protect sources. It would be, I'm speculating they didn't have information someone was going to be killed. In a tactical sense, who's doing it and when, or something like that.
So there were some comments made. There was a question that Erwin Kotler had a threat to his life. It was believed by Iran, and that he was provided security. The question was, why can't security be provided to individuals who are facing similar threats from foreign governments? Is there a different level because he's a diplomat, or he's like a government official, or what's going on there?
I have no idea. I just know sometimes you get information which is vague, and sometimes you get information which is specific. I don't know.
Okay. In terms of profiling of the Sikh community, now CSIS seems to understand the role of India in Canada, but we're also hearing from a number of Sikhs on the ground that CSIS is asking them questions about members of their gurdwaras, members in the community. What can individuals do? What are their rights when they're being approached? What can the Sikh community generally do about being surveilled or profiled? So if CSIS comes to you and says, we want to have a conversation, and in that conversation they're asking questions, what might be the motivation behind that, and what rights does an individual have?
Well, you don't have to talk to them. I'm not saying don't. Yeah. You don't have to talk to them.
Okay. In terms of India's activities in Canada, our election guide has called for a public inquiry into the 3 assassinations that the RCMP has called out, as well as the extortions, the shootings. Do you think it would be worthwhile to have a public inquiry into transnational repression? Because I know Commissioner Hogue had said that she was only able to scratch the surface. Do you think this is something that would be worthwhile? Do you think the government, the next government, would be interested in doing that?
Absolutely, and I actually said that publicly. We know why there was the Commission of Inquiry into Foreign Interference. It was on electoral interference. That's what was driving it originally with China, and I don't think the inquiry had the capacity or the mandate or the time or whatever to go into transnational repression from 3, 4, 5 countries. But I think in the case of what's happened in the Sikh community, there should be an inquiry. There should be something beyond just the criminal prosecution that's there. It should be like a holistic, more comprehensive review of what's been going on, because as I've said many times, it's exceeded what other foreign states have done in transnational repression. It's gone way beyond what China or Russia or Iran to a certain degree has been doing, and other countries.
So moving forward, we're already seeing the US trying to rebuild ties with India, even after the whole Gurpatwant Singh Pannu assassination plot. Individuals being arrested and currently being tried. We anticipate that at some point Canada will start on that path as well. Yeah. What is a principled way of approaching rebuilding these sort of ties? What should Canada do moving forward if it wants to repair its ties with India, as it seems that Mark Carney's already said that he intends to do so, and Pierre Poilievre had already said that if he formed government, he would do so. Yeah. But in your opinion, what would be the principled way of doing that?
I think you cannot move forward and improve relations until you've sorted out the national security challenges, problems, murder, all the other activities. There has to be, when there's things that go on behind closed doors we don't know about, and there's a prosecution pending. But last I checked, whenever it came out publicly, 6 months ago, whenever, there wasn't really signs that the Indian government had cooperated an awful lot. That was always been dragging, right? They were talk to the hand, that type of thing. So to me, you can't move forward and, everything's lovely in the garden if you leave that unsorted, right? That's why I say if you have an inquiry, but at the same time, India still is accountable for what they did. But the frustrating thing is I think this is just the way it goes. Like you look at Saudi Arabia and killing Mr. Khashoggi, and then eventually the US in particular got re-engaged with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so even with what India attempted to do in New York, the US has got back their relationship. And Canada being not even a middle power anymore, there's going to be a lot of pressure for whoever forms the government to get back in a relationship with India. But I still think the national security issue has to be held. It has to be a line in the sand. They have to be fully cooperative with what went on and be accountable. Otherwise, there's just no justice.
Do you think, how likely do you think that is, given that even Canadian sources have named people as high up as Amit Shah, the Home Minister, and a close, second in command in India, as being involved directly in these sort of plots in the line of command? Do you think that's going to play a role? Or is it just that, they hope for a new government at some point? Or do you think it'll probably be right now? Do you think they'll have to still deal with the BJP, even though they have people like Amit Shah still sitting?
Yeah, it's hard to say. They have a habit of throwing people under the bus, but the director of RAW reports to the Prime Minister, and then there's Amit Shah as well. So it's hard to believe that at the most senior level of the Indian government, they didn't know about this and know this was unfolding. And so they can't just sweep it under the rug.
Do you foresee India continuing these sort of activities? Do you think they've learned their lesson?
I think they have. I mean, you know, their intelligence services would now be seen as threats and pariahs. Their diplomats, where are their diplomats going to be posted to a lot of countries now because they had their hands involved in these activities? I think there's no real going back for India. I think it's a huge black mark. Yeah.
Okay. And now you've been an intervener in the Hague Commission, and we, of course, were there as well. What recommendations from the Hague Commission do you think should be implemented by the next government that are going to be the most effective in countering this sort of foreign interference? What do you think the next government should be?
Well, a fair number of the recommendations were kind of preempted by Bill C-70. The government got out ahead of the commission, probably because they realized they weren't seen as really strong on national security, with changes to the CSIS Act disclosures and so on, this new Foreign Interference Act, the registry, all sorts of things that I think are very effective, and the criminalization of transnational repression when it comes forward. But then that begs the question about RCMP capacity and ability as well. So I think the government is going in the right route with that. And then the biggest point that came out of the inquiry was that actually disinformation is more of a scourge than foreign interference, in the human sense. So I think they got it, and I still think the inquiry was a success, even though not everybody got what they wanted to hear. If you wanted to, I don't know, it was kind of partisan at times, but yeah, I think we're going in the right place, right direction.
And as the Sikh community specifically, I mean, you're from a different perspective. You're from an outsider who's looking in. What should we be doing in terms of making sure, first of all, India is held accountable, secondly, countering this wave of anti-Sikh hate, and thirdly, just protecting ourselves from transnational repression? What are the sort of things that we as a community have been doing well, need to be doing more of, have been doing poorly? What's your take?
Yeah, and I mean, I just want to say, my heart goes out to you. It really does. I don't know the level of anxiety and fear that you have, which is perfectly understandable, I can't pretend to say I know, but you're Canadians. We're all Canadians, I'm an Irish immigrant descendant, and we really have to stick together. And maybe lean on your representatives, maybe your MPs, your MPPs. I guess more outreach to the point you can. Whew. It's a tough one.
Yeah, no, in terms of even Khalistan advocacy, so if we compare Khalistan to any other independence movement, whether that's Quebec's independent movement, Scotland, Irish, it's taken very differently. What should we do more of? I mean, let's be honest, there was a period for at least, a good 10, 15 years that our community was very, very anxious about using even the word Khalistan.
Yeah.
But with the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, we've seen people really come back and reclaim that term, say it fearlessly and say, we won't be intimidated.
Yeah.
What, and I tried to ask this before, but maybe give me your frank assessment. What should the Khalistan movement, in terms of people advocating for Khalistan, be doing a better job of? Because we've had this discussion before. I don't think the average Canadian understands it. I mean, it's already been defined as extremism and terrorism by the Indians.
Yeah.
How can we do a better job of normalizing and explaining that word?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a tough one. There's people in this country that, I think voted for Scotland to separate, or like you say, Catalan, or all sorts of other areas. it's hard to say because some people will just see what they want to see or see through a filter of bias or interpret it as synonymous with terrorism, right? Why are they protesting? Why don't they go home? That's usually the general Canadian reflex, I think, which is very unfortunate. I don't know what to say as far as what you can do. Is any movement that is political, nonviolent, legitimate, dissenting, peaceful, well, there's really nothing more you can do.
Yeah, fair. So I've asked a lot of questions. Is there something that maybe we haven't touched on that you'd like to share with the folks present here? Any sort of a topic or issue that you think we should know about, or something that I haven't touched on so far?
No,
We're good?
I didn't think of anything.
Okay. So at this point, we are open to a few questions from the crowd. So happy to take any questions that you might have. Yep. Behind. Yep. You. Adesko?
I would like to first thank you for your time and really appreciate the discussion. Recognizing that the focus is on transnational repression, just bringing it back to India's narrative and the way in which the message is being spread and the focus on Sikh is very discriminatory in that sense. How fearful do Sikh Canadians have to be in terms of their own ability to walk the streets without facing discrimination and discriminatory comments from other people?
Oh. You mean how fearful should people be?
Is the anti-Sikh threat so great that it should be something we fear, walking the streets, maybe at night, or going to school on a day-to-day basis?
I really don't know. I think it's. I really don't know. I don't know how we measure the anti-Sikh hate.
Well, I think any community should. No community should be fearful. I think we have laws for that, and I think law enforcement should, of course, be aware of it. We, of course, at WSO are currently doing our anti-Sikh hate study. So we had town halls in every major Canadian city, and we've had surveys filled out. And this is in partnership with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. But we have found a sharp rise in anti-Sikh hate. We have seen, even here in Brampton, 2 students who were badly beaten in their schools. One student, a young grade 2 student, was so badly beaten she had to go for ultrasounds, and because she was new from Punjab, she was not covered by healthcare, and her school gave her a gift card to cover her ultrasounds. So we are seeing, and the fact is she stayed in school the entire day, even though she cried, she wanted to go home. Her parents weren't told. So even the general sentiment towards Sikhs, I think, is really turning. When we put out this election guide, I received hate calls saying, how dare you demand anything in this country? You know, if you want to ask for something, go back to your own country and ask for it. So we're definitely seeing a rise in anti-Sikh hate, and I think part of that is going to be that we have to define it. So anti-Semitism has a definition, Islamophobia has a definition, and anti-Sikh hate will have a definition once we're done, before the spring is done. So that's my perspective on it. But you have a follow-up?
I was going to just ask about a follow-up. I was going to say, at what point, or what is the point that we define as this needs a definition? Because after 9/11, there was Islamophobia, there's homophobia, there's anti-Semitic behaviors, and the rise in hatred. Like, speaking from my own experience, it was just last week I was told to go back to my country. Now, I don't think that's something that I would have heard a year or 2 years ago, but amidst all this hatred that's being brought up, I feel like we need to have a term, if anything, or a more solidified benchmark in terms of what this hatred and what this sort of discriminatory remarks are all kind of fall under?
No, absolutely. Other questions? Someone else had a question? Yeah.
On the topic of transnational repression, that went back to the time that you were in CSIS, the actions of like Indian governments being 7 times per annum just wasn't a priority for the Canadian government. From the perspective of a lot of people in the Sikh community, the perspective was that it felt like the Canadian government didn't see the Sikhs in Canada as Canadians, and the reason that there wasn't action was because this was something the Indian government was doing to itself, and not something the Indian government was doing to Canada. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to whether or not that was an attitude that you experienced when you were at CSIS?
I would say, well, first of all, when I did work what we call transnational repression, that was, back in my early days in the service. And when the service was created, they did like the RCMP security service. They collected an awful lot of secrets and they kept them locked up and collected dust and that sort of thing. They used it tactically, but there was never any outcomes on it. Now, we're not talking about what's happened to the Sikh community with India, but still, there was a lot of activity, let's say from Soviet intelligence, Soviet bloc intelligence, and things like that. I could say it, and I don't know if you're going to believe me, but there's no entrenched attitude in the service towards people from South Asia, towards people Sikh. There are none. They go after the threat. They target the threats to national security. It's in their DNA. Why was India not taken as seriously as it is now? I think somewhere somebody dropped the ball. Somewhere the momentum and the sophistication of foreign interference and transnational repression from India was growing. I had heard stuff in the media that the service tried to do some disruptive activities and were stopped, and that does happen. I'm aware of that. Not with respect to India, but I know with that new mandate that happens often. But somewhere along the line, it was neglected. And that was the failure that also came out of the commission. The commissioner did say that the government failed to deal with foreign interference, reading reports, not doing anything, not finding reports or reading them. And so I think part of it is a governance issue as well in terms of intelligence community, in terms of the government writ large. They never, and it's not just a Liberal government, it goes back to the Harper government, they never dealt with transnational repression.
So there was a report by Sam Cooper, who, no, I guess we can take it with a grain of sand, not sure if it's true or not, but he published a report shortly after the Hardeep Singh Nijjar announcement that in 2017, CSIS had wanted to crack down on an Indian network operating out of the Vancouver consulate that was targeting Sikhs there, but the Prime Minister's office had told them to lay off and not do so because it might jeopardize relations with India with an upcoming India trip. Does that seem like, is that sort of political influence?
That's quite possible. I mean, there's a lot the service deals with operationally. Not many issues that have to go up for a policy level, but sometimes there are things that will impact on another country, and there'll be some sort of consultation. So that could very well be true. The mandate came in 2016. I remember when it came in. I was in the field at the time. And so that could have been a very effective way of CSIS neutralizing some of India's activities. But then they're part of the big picture, big world, whatever the government decides.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Okay, so that's it in terms of our comments. Anything to finish up with? But thank you for all of you for coming, and thank you, Dan, for coming.